The Admiral of the Unconquered Soul, the Robert Smalls Saga. The Hook. In the pre-dawn mist of May 13, 1862, a heavily armed Confederate warship named the CSS Planter slipped quietly out of Charleston Harbor. On the bridge stood a man in a captain's straw hat, his back to the shore, signaling the rebel forts with perfect precision. The sentries waved him through, thinking he was their commander. They were wrong. Underneath that hat was Robert Smalls, an enslaved harbor pilot who was not just stealing a ship, he was stealing himself, his family, and the secrets of the Confederacy in the most audacious heist in maritime history. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Watched the Tides. Robert was born in Beaufort, South Carolina, in a small cabin behind his master's house. While other children played, Robert watched the Atlantic. He understood early that the ocean was both a wall and a doorway. His mother, Lydia, feared his defiant spirit. She made him witness the horrors of the slave auctions in town, hoping to terrify him into submission for his own safety. Instead, it planted a seed of cold, hard resolve. I will not die a piece of property. By the age of 12, Robert was sent to Charleston to be hired out. He worked as a rigger, a longshoreman, and eventually a pilot. He learned the language of the currents and the hidden pulse of the harbor. He became so skilled that he knew the Charleston waters better than any white captain, yet he was forced to hand over nearly every penny of his wages to his owner. Chapter 2. The Planter and the Plot. As the Civil War broke out, Robert was assigned to the CSS Planter, a fast, shallow-draft vessel used as a dispatch boat for the Confederate Trust. He listened. He memorized code signals. He noted when the white officers were lax. The plan was hatched in whispers. It wasn't just about him. It was about his wife, Hannah, and their 2 children. I'm going to take the Planter. If we are caught, we will blow up the ship and die together. We will not go back to the lash. Chapter 3. The Midnight Heist. On the night of May 12th, the white officers did something they weren't supposed to do. They stayed ashore for a party. This was the window. At 3 a.m., Smalls and a small crew of enslaved sailors picked up their families at a hidden dock. The tension was suffocating. To reach the Union blockade, they had to pass 5 Confederate forts, including the massive guns of Fort Sumter. Smalls donned the captain's signature straw hat and mimicked the captain's posture. At every checkpoint, he blew the steam whistle, the correct secret signals, and was waved through. One mistake meant instant execution. As they passed Sumter, the crew held their breath. The sentry called out, "Pass the Planter!" Chapter 4. From Fugitive to Legislator. When the Planter reached the Union fleet, Robert hauled down the palmetto flag and raised a white bedsheet. He didn't just bring a ship, he brought the Confederate code books and a map of the mines he had helped lay in the harbor. He became an overnight sensation in the North. But Robert Smalls wasn't finished. He became the first black captain of a U.S. vessel. After the war, he returned to Beaufort, the very place he was enslaved, and bought his former master's house. He didn't stop there. He entered politics, helping to write the South Carolina Constitution and serving 5 terms in the U.S. Congress, fighting for the right to vote and public education for all. Chapter 5. The Prize and the Paradox. When the CSS Planter finally pulled alongside the USS Onward, the Union sailors were stunned. They expected a fight. Instead, they saw a black man in a captain's hat, bowing politely and offering a warship as a gift. "I thought they might be of some use to the federal government," Smalls said calmly. But the North was a complicated place. While the newspapers hailed him as a hero,
The U.S. Navy didn't quite know what to do with a black man who had more tactical knowledge than most of their officers. They awarded him prize money for the ship, but it was only a fraction of what a white man would have received. Robert didn't complain. He took the money and immediately reinvested it in his people. But his eyes were on a bigger prize, the right for black men to fight. Chapter 6. The Battle of Folly Island. Smalls became a crucial advisor to the Union. He met with President Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of State Edwin Stanton in Washington. He wasn't just a pilot, he was a diplomat. He convinced Lincoln that black men weren't just capable of being soldiers, they were essential to winning the war. Back on the water, Smalls was placed back on the Planter, now a Union transport ship. In 1863, during a fierce battle at Folly Island, the Planter came under heavy Confederate fire. The white captain of the ship panicked. He wanted to surrender. Robert Smalls knew that if they surrendered, the black crew would be executed or sold back into slavery on the spot. He refused to let the captain give up. In the middle of a hail of cannonballs, Smalls took command of the ship, navigated it through the crossfire, and saved the crew. For this bravery, he was promoted to captain, making him the first African-American captain in the history of the United States Navy. Chapter 7. The Master of the House. The war ended in 1865, but for Robert, the real battle was just beginning. He returned to Beaufort, South Carolina. He walked down the streets where he had once been forbidden to walk without a pass. In a moment of poetic justice that sounds like fiction, the mansion of his former master, Henry McKee, was put up for tax sale. Robert Smalls walked into the auction and bought it with his own hard-earned money. He didn't just buy the house for status, he turned it into a sanctuary. When the widow of his former master, Mrs. McKee, returned to the house, confused and broken by the war, Smalls did the unthinkable. He didn't cast her out. He invited her in, gave her a room, and let her live out her days in comfort. He chose to be the master of his own character, not just a master of property. Chapter 8. The Lion of Reconstruction. The story now enters the halls of power. Smalls realized that freedom without the law was just a temporary reprieve. He helped draft the new South Carolina Constitution, insisting on a revolutionary idea: free, compulsory public education for all children, regardless of race. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. In Washington, he was a giant. He faced death threats from the Ku Klux Klan and survived multiple assassination attempts. During one campaign, a mob of armed men surrounded his carriage. Smalls didn't flinch. He looked them in the eye and said, "I have faced the guns of Sumter. Do you think I am afraid of you?" He served 5 terms, fighting for civil rights decades before the movement of the 1960s. He was a man who lived 100 years ahead of his time.
Chapter 9. The Red Shirts and the Edge of Night. By the late 1870s, the political landscape was shifting. A paramilitary group known as the Red Shirts, white supremacists determined to reclaim power by any means necessary, began a campaign of terror. Their goal was simple: stop Robert Smalls and his supporters from voting. During a campaign stop at Edgefield, Smalls found himself surrounded by over 2,000 armed men on horseback, all wearing blood-red shirts. The air smelled of gunpowder and horses. His supporters were terrified, but Smalls stood on the podium, his chest out, a man who had steered a wooden ship through the iron fire of Fort Sumter. "You can kill me," he shouted over the jeers, "but you cannot kill the idea I represent." He survived that day by sheer force of personality, but the Red Shirts were relentless. They framed him for a bribe he never took, a political hit job designed to ruin his reputation. He was sentenced to prison, but he didn't break. He fought the conviction all the way to the governor, eventually receiving a full pardon.
He wasn't just surviving, he was proving that the new laws of the land applied even to those the old guard hated most. Chapter 10. The Last Stand at the Convention. In 1895, South Carolina held a constitutional convention with one specific goal: to disenfranchise black voters. Out of 160 delegates, only 6 were black. Robert Smalls was their leader. He stood before a room full of men who viewed him as an enemy of their way of life. He gave a speech that is still studied by historians today. He pointed out the hypocrisy of a state that wanted the labor of his people, but not their voices. "My race needs no special defense," he thundered. "All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life." He lost the vote that day. The new Constitution was passed, stripping away the rights he had spent 30 years building. It was a crushing blow. Yet Smalls remained in Beaufort, a living monument to a freedom that refused to be extinguished. Chapter 11. The Admiral's Sunset. In his final years, Smalls became the collector of customs in Beaufort, a high-ranking federal position. He sat on the porch of the McKee Mansion, the house where he was born a slave and which he now owned. Children, both black and white, would walk by, and he would tell them stories of the planter. He wasn't a man of bitterness, he was a man of legacy. Even as Jim Crow laws tightened around the South, Smalls remained a king in his community. He was the one people went to when they needed justice, a job, or hope. He passed away in 1914 at the age of 75. His funeral was the largest the town of Beaufort had ever seen. People traveled for miles, not just to mourn a man, but to honor the symbol of an unconquerable soul. Chapter 12. The Ghost of the Planter. Today, Robert Smalls is often a footnote in history books, but his impact is everywhere. The CSS Planter was eventually lost at sea years after the war, but Smalls' story remains an anchor for American democracy. He proved that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the calculation that something else is more important. From the engine room of a rebel ship to the floor of the U.S. Congress, he navigated the most treacherous waters in American history and never once lost his way.
Chapter 13. The Secret Logic of a Harbor Pilot. To understand Smalls, you have to understand the mind of a harbor pilot. In the 1860s, navigation wasn't just about steering, it was about memory. There were no GPS systems, and the Confederate Navy had filled Charleston Harbor with torpedoes, underwater mines. Robert Smalls had spent months helping the Confederates lay these mines. He didn't just drop them, he mapped them in his mind. He knew that if he moved his ship 3 feet to the left at the Devil's Backbone sandbar, he would trigger an explosion that would send them all to the bottom. This knowledge was his insurance policy. During the escape, he wasn't just lucky, he was playing a deadly game of connect the dots. When he finally reached the Union blockade, the information he provided was worth more than the ship itself. He gave the Union the keys to the city, showing them exactly where the Confederate defenses were blind. This section of his life illustrates the power of the invisible expert, the man who is overlooked but holds all the cards. Chapter 15. The Legend of the Black Commodore. Even in his old age, Smalls was a force of nature. There is a famous story from the late 1990s when a lynch mob was forming in Beaufort to take a young black man from the jail. Smalls, now an old man with a white beard, didn't call the police, he didn't hide. He walked out onto the street, stood between the mob and the jail, and reminded the men that he had defended this town from the British and the Confederates alike. He told them that if they wanted to break the law, they would have to start by stepping over the man who had given the town its schools. The mob dispersed.
He was the only man in South Carolina who could stop a lynching with just a look. Chapter 16. The Modern Echo. The story of Robert Smalls didn't end in 1914. His descendants continued his legacy of firsts. His great-grandson served in the military and worked for the government, keeping the family's tradition of public service alive. In 2004, the U.S. Army named him after him, the USAV Major General Robert Smalls. It was the first time an Army vessel was named after an African American. For the USA audience, this is the ultimate validation. The government that once considered him property now carries his name into battle on the hulls of its ships.
Chapter 17. The Ghost Pilot of the Stono River. After the escape of the Planter, the Union High Command realized Smalls was their most valuable intelligence asset in the South. He wasn't just a captain, he was a human map. In late 1862, the Union began a series of daring raids along the South Carolina coast. These were mosquito wars, fast, shallow-water strikes designed to destroy supply lines from the Confederacy. Because Smalls knew every hidden creek and sandbar from Charleston to Savannah, he was the only one who could guide the massive Union ironclads through the treacherous Stono River. Imagine the scene, a moonless night, the massive, clanking iron hulls of Union ships moving through water so narrow that tree branches brushed the decks. Smalls stood at the helm, blind to the eye, but seeing through the memory of his hands. He led the Union fleet directly to the rear of Confederate batteries, allowing the North to capture key positions without firing a single shot from the front. He was a phantom, dismantling the Confederacy from the inside out. Chapter 18. The Siege of Charleston, 1863. The story reaches a fever pitch during the Second Battle of Fort Sumter. The Union was desperate to take Charleston, the cradle of secession. Smalls was on the bridge of the Keokuk, an experimental ironclad. The battle was an inferno. The Confederate guns at Sumter, which Smalls had once saluted as a slave, were now raining iron down upon him. The Keokuk was hit nearly 100 times. The ship began to sink. While others panicked, Smalls remained at the wheel. He steered the dying ship away from the Confederate guns, saving the crew from certain capture or death. It was here that the Union Navy realized Smalls didn't just have local knowledge, he had the iron will of a naval commander. Chapter 19. The Smalls Strategy in Washington. Between battles, Smalls was sent to Washington, D.C. to help the Lincoln administration. Here we see the transformation of the sailor into the statesman. He walked into the White House, a man who technically was still considered contraband by some legal definitions. He sat with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. He didn't just ask for freedom, he presented a business case for the black soldier. He argued that 50,000 black men in the South were ready to fight, and they knew the terrain better than any Northern general. This was the Smalls strategy. He bypassed the moral arguments and went straight to the tactical ones. Shortly after his visit, the order was given to begin large-scale recruitment of the United States Colored Troops, or USCT. Every black soldier who wore the Union blue owed a debt to the pilot from Beaufort. Chapter 20. The Reconstruction Riots. The war ended, but the peace was more dangerous. During the 1876 elections, Smalls faced the Hamburg Massacre. A group of black militia members were besieged by a white mob. Smalls rushed to the scene, not with a gun, but with the authority of his office. He tried to mediate, but the air was thick with the smell of the New South rising to crush the old dreams of freedom. He saw his friends dragged into the street. This moment changed him. He realized that the paper freedom granted by the 13th Amendment was useless without the iron freedom of the law. He returned to Congress with a fury.
He began drafting the legislation that would eventually become the blueprint for the 20th century civil rights movement. He was no longer just fighting for his life. He was fighting for the soul of the American Constitution.
Chapter 21. The Frame-Up in the Low Country. By 1877, the Redemption Movement, the effort by white Southern Democrats to take back political control, was in full swing. Robert Smalls was the most powerful black man in the state, which made him the primary target. He was a symbol of everything they hated, a former slave who was now their superior in intellect, wealth, and rank. The opposition couldn't beat him at the polls, so they decided to destroy his character. They accused Smalls of taking a $5,000 bribe, a massive sum at the time, to influence a printing contract years earlier. The evidence was flimsy, based on the testimony of men who had been promised immunity if they turned against Smalls. But in a South Carolina courtroom in 1877, the truth was often secondary to the agenda. Smalls stood in the dock, the same man who had stared down the cannons of Fort Sumter. He watched as the jury, all white, many of them former Confederate soldiers, deliberated his fate. Chapter 22. The Verdict and the Iron Bars. The jury returned a verdict: guilty. Robert Smalls, the hero of the Union, the captain of the Planter, and a sitting U.S. congressman, was sentenced to 2 years in the state penitentiary. The news sent shockwaves through the North. To the black community, it was a signal that the Dark Ages were returning. Smalls was led to a cell. For the first time since 1862, he was not a free man. But even in prison, he carried himself with an aura of command. He spent his time reading and writing letters to his supporters, refusing to let the walls break his spirit. "They can lock up the man," he wrote, "but they cannot imprison the truth." Chapter 23. The Governor's Dilemma. The conviction was a political nightmare for the South. If they kept Smalls in prison, they risked a federal intervention. If they let him go, they admitted the trial was a sham. Finally, a deal was struck. In exchange for the federal government dropping charges against white officials accused of election fraud, the governor of South Carolina granted Robert Smalls a full and unconditional pardon. Smalls walked out of prison, his head held high. He hadn't just survived the trial, he had exposed the corruption of the system. He immediately went back to Beaufort and was re-elected to Congress. His constituents didn't care about the verdict. They knew their captain was a man of honor. Chapter 24. The Guardian of Beaufort. In his final decade in the House of Representatives, Smalls focused on the economic independence of his people. He knew that without land and jobs, freedom was a shadow. He secured federal funding to build a naval hospital in Port Royal and worked to ensure that the Navy Yard stayed in South Carolina, providing thousands of jobs for both black and white workers. He was a master of pork barrel politics, using the system to feed his community. He also became a legendary protector of his neighbors. There is a story of a white man in Beaufort who went bankrupt and was about to lose his farm. Smalls, remembering the man's kindness to a group of freedmen years earlier, quietly paid off the man's debt. He didn't do it for the headlines. He did it because he believed that a leader's job was to steady the boat for everyone. Chapter 25. The Sunset of a Titan. As the 20th century dawned, Smalls saw the rise of Jim Crow, the laws that legalized segregation. It was a heartbreaking time for a man who had seen the bright morning of Reconstruction. He spent his final days on the porch of the McKee mansion. He was often seen sitting in a rocking chair, looking out toward the water. He could still hear the ghost of the planter's whistle in the wind. Before he died, in 1914, a reporter asked him if he regretted anything about his daring escape or his turbulent political career. Smalls smiled and looked at his hands, hands that had steered a warship and written the laws of a state. "I have navigated many channels.
Some were deep and some were filled with rocks, but I always kept my eye on the lighthouse.
Chapter 26. The Long Shadow of Beaufort. When Robert Smalls died in 1914, the American South was a place of deep shadows. Jim Crow laws had scrubbed his name from many textbooks, but in the black households of the South Carolina Low Country, he was never forgotten. He was referred to as the Moses of the Marine. His home, the McKee Mansion, became a beacon. Even as the decades passed, the fact that a black man had owned the finest house in town remained a quiet, powerful defiance. It served as a reminder to every local child that the current social order was not permanent, because one man had already broken it. Chapter 27. The Smalls Strategy and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Fast forward to the 1960s. During the height of the civil rights movement, activists looked back at the Reconstruction era to find legal precedents for their struggle. They found Robert Smalls. The argument Smalls made in the 1895 Constitutional Convention about the fundamental right to the ballot and the illegality of literacy tests became the cornerstone of the legal arguments used by the NAACP and Martin Luther King Jr.'s legal teams. When President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, he was essentially finishing the work Smalls had started on the floor of the South Carolina legislature nearly a century earlier. Chapter 28. The 2014 Discovery. For over 100 years, the CSS Planter, the ship that started it all, lay hidden under the shifting sands off the coast of South Carolina. It had become a ghost ship, a legend that some doubted ever existed. In 2014, a team of NOAA scientists and marine archaeologists used side-scan sonar and magnetic sensors to scan the graveyard of the Atlantic. They found a magnetic anomaly near Cape Romaine. After months of diving and research, they confirmed it: the remains of the Planter. The discovery hit the national news in the USA. Suddenly, a new generation of Americans learned about the man who stole a warship. The discovery of the ship served as a physical receipt for his courage. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was iron and wood at the bottom of the sea. Chapter 30. The Great-Granddaughter's Torch. The bloodline of Robert Smalls didn't fade into obscurity. His great-granddaughter, Helen Bulwer Moore, became a prominent scholar and keeper of his flame. She spent her life ensuring that his papers, his furniture, and his story were preserved in the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Because of her work, when you walk into the Smithsonian today, you don't just see a display about slavery, you see a display about victory. You see the story of a man who refused to accept the historical reality he was born into, and instead built a new one. Chapter 30. The Eternal Pilot. Today, if you visit Beaufort, South Carolina, you can stand at the bust of Robert Smalls at the Tabernacle Baptist Church. He is buried there, overlooking the town he served. His story is the ultimate American information action loop. He gathered information, the codes, the maps, the tide schedules. He took calculated action, the theft of the planter, and he used the result to change the law of the land. He remains the only man in American history to be an enslaved person, a fugitive, a naval hero, a millionaire property owner, a state legislator, a U.S. congressman. He didn't just live a life, he lived 10 lives in the span of one.